January 15th, 1942. Berlin. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring sat behind his ornate desk at the Air Ministry, examining a translated American newspaper with barely concealed amusement. President Roosevelt had just announced his production targets for the year: 50,000 aircraft. The number seemed so absurd that Göring had asked his translator to verify it 3 times. 50,000. The Americans, who had produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in all of 1940, were claiming they would manufacture 50,000 in a single year. Göring's aide, Oberst Werner Baumbach, stood at attention as the Reichsmarschall began to laugh, a deep theatrical laugh that echoed through the marble halls. 50,000 planes, Göring said, tapping the paper with one jeweled finger. The Americans think war is like one of their Hollywood films. Pure fantasy. He turned to Baumbach. Do you know what 50,000 planes means? It means building 137 aircraft every single day, including Sundays, including Christmas. The Americans barely have 137 trained aviation engineers in their entire country. Göring had reason for his confidence. He had built the Luftwaffe from nothing, transforming Germany from a nation banned from having an air force into the world's premier aerial power in less than a decade. He knew what aircraft production required: skilled craftsmen who understood the delicate balance of aerodynamics, specialized machine tools that took years to manufacture and calibrate, aluminum alloys whose formulas were closely guarded secrets, engines that required precision beyond what any automobile manufacturer could achieve. The Americans had none of this. Their aircraft industry in 1940 had employed fewer than 60,000 workers total. Germany employed that many at single factories. Let me explain something, Göring continued, warming to his theme. We have been preparing for this war since 1933. 9 years of development, training, infrastructure. We have the world's finest aircraft designers: Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Focke-Wulf. Our pilots trained in secret in Russia, then openly in Spain. Our factories run 3 shifts. And with all of this, all of our advantages, we produced 8,000 aircraft last year. 8,000, with everything optimized for war. The Americans think they can produce 6 times that number while converting from civilian production. It's not confidence, it's delusion. What Göring didn't know, what he couldn't conceive, was that in a converted automobile factory in Willow Run, Michigan, a production line unlike anything the world had ever seen was already taking shape. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, had been brought to see the B-24 Liberator bomber at Consolidated Aircraft's plant in San Diego. The traditional aircraft manufacturers built planes the way they always had, in fixed positions, with teams of skilled workers climbing over and through each aircraft, carefully fitting each component. Sorensen watched for 3 days, saying nothing, taking notes. On the flight back to Detroit, he sketched out something revolutionary: a moving assembly line for bombers, not small fighters or training aircraft, 4-engine heavy bombers, each one 67 feet long with a wingspan of 110 feet. 25,000 individual parts, brought together in a choreographed industrial ballet. His colleagues at Ford thought he had lost his mind. Albert Kahn, the architect brought in to design the building, initially refused the commission, saying it was impossible. But Henry Ford himself had approved the concept with a single sentence: "Build it like we build cars, only bigger." The main assembly building at Willow Run would stretch for more than a mile, the longest production line ever constructed. At one end, raw materials would enter. At the other end, every 63 minutes, a completed B-24 bomber would roll out. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The statistics of construction alone defied belief. 19 million pounds of structural steel, 5 million pounds of aluminum and magnesium castings, 2.5 million square feet of concrete flooring. The building was so large it had its own weather systems. Clouds would form near the ceiling on humid days. But size was just the beginning. Sorensen had reimagined the entire concept of aircraft production. Where traditional manufacturers saw complexity requiring craft precision, he saw standardization opportunities. Every rivet hole was precisely located on jigs. Every wire bundle was preformed on templates. Workers didn't need to understand aerodynamics. They needed to know their specific task, repeated endlessly, perfectly, like a Detroit assembly line. A farm worker from Iowa could be trained in 2 weeks to perform tasks that German workers studied for 2 years to master. 3 months after Göring's dismissive laughter, the first reports began reaching Berlin from intelligence sources in America. They seemed impossible. The Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach was producing C-47 transport aircraft at a rate of 1 every 4 hours. The Boeing plant in Seattle had something called a moving assembly line for B-17 bombers. Most incredibly, companies that had never built aircraft were receiving massive contracts. General Motors was building Grumman Avengers, Chrysler was manufacturing engines for Boeing B-29s, even the Singer Sewing Machine Company was producing aircraft components. Göring's staff dismissed these reports as American propaganda designed to demoralize the German public. "Consider the source," General der Flieger Hans Jeschonek told his staff. "These are the same Americans who claimed their cowboys could defeat our panzers." But Major Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11, flying patrols over the occupied Netherlands, was beginning to see troubling signs. American bombers had started appearing in March 1942. Not many at first, just probing raids. But each month brought more. "They're not better than our aircraft," he wrote in his diary. "Many are inferior, but they keep coming. Where are they getting them?" The answer lay in a complete reimagining of industrial production that German planners, trapped in their conception of craftsmanship and quality, could never grasp. In Seattle, Boeing had hired housewives, teenagers, and men rejected from military service for physical limitations. They called them Rosie the Riveters, and by 1943, women would comprise 35% of the aviation workforce. Geraldine Doyle, operating a rivet gun in a Michigan factory, could install 3,000 rivets in a shift, more than a trained German craftsman, because she didn't need to understand why each rivet was placed, only that it met the template specifications. The Americans had discovered something profound. In mass production, systemic efficiency trumped individual skill. A precisely designed system operated by motivated amateurs could outproduce master craftsmen working in traditional methods. Boeing's Plant 2 was producing 17 B-17s every day by summer 1943, not per week or per month, every single day. The parking lots couldn't hold the completed bombers. They lined them up on nearby roads, then in fields, then wherever space could be found. By autumn 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Hans-Joachim Hajo Hermann, architect of the Wild Sow night fighter tactics, sat in a briefing room in Berlin examining aerial reconnaissance photographs that had been smuggled out of America at enormous risk. The images showed the Willow Run plant from above. The building covered more area than the entire Messerschmitt complex at Augsburg, but it was the ruse of completed B-24s outside that made Hermann go cold. He counted them carefully, then counted again. More than 400 bombers, parked like automobiles, waiting for delivery. "This is one factory," he told Göring's staff. "One. And these bombers are their overflow, planes they haven't even bothered to deliver yet. They're manufacturing aircraft faster than they can use them." The room fell silent. Someone suggested the photographs might be doctored. Hermann shook his head. "I've been fighting these bombers over Hamburg. I know they're real. Every bomber we shoot down is replaced by 5 more. This isn't war anymore. It's mathematics. And we're on the wrong side of the equation." The mathematics were indeed staggering. By December 1943, American factories were producing 8,000 aircraft per month. Germany's entire production for 1943 would total 25,000 aircraft, what America was now producing every 3 months. But the raw numbers only told part of the story. American planes were being produced with improvements integrated directly into the production lines. Each month's B-17s had modifications based on combat reports from Europe. Extended-range fuel tanks, improved armor plating, better gun positions, changes that would take German factories months to implement were being incorporated into American production within weeks. The Americans weren't just building more planes, they were building better planes, faster, while building more of them. It was an industrial logic that German planners, with their emphasis on revolutionary design over evolutionary improvement, couldn't match. The Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, Germany's technological masterpiece, took over 3,000 man-hours to produce. A P-51 Mustang took less than 800. By the time Germany could build one revolutionary jet, America had built 4 conventional fighters that, in mass formations, would prove more decisive. Göring received his first truly accurate production assessment in March 1944, delivered personally by Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer had done something unprecedented. He had compiled not just the claimed American production figures, but corroborating evidence from multiple sources: Swiss industrial spies, Swedish observers, intercepted communications, even testimony from captured American airmen who, believing the information was common knowledge, freely discussed the factories they had trained near. The numbers were undeniable. America had produced 96,318 aircraft in 1943. They were on track to produce over 100,000 in 1944. "This cannot be," Göring said, his voice barely audible. "The resources alone, where are they getting the aluminum?" Speer had that answer too. The Americans had built new aluminum smelters powered by hydroelectric dams constructed solely for war production. They were mining bauxite in Arkansas, processing it in Tennessee, and shipping aluminum to factories that hadn't existed 2 years earlier. They had created entire supply chains from nothing, entire cities devoted to single aspects of aircraft production. The human dimension of American production was equally incomprehensible to German planners. By 1944, the American aircraft industry employed over 2 million workers. Willow Run alone employed 42,000 people, running 3 shifts continuously. They had built dormitories, shopping centers, schools, and hospitals just to support the workforce. Buses ran 24 hours a day, bringing workers from Detroit 30 miles away. The plant had its own fire department, police force, and medical facilities capable of handling everything from industrial accidents to childbirth. Because pregnant women were working on the line until days before delivery, then returning weeks after. This wasn't just industrial mobilization, it was social revolution. The grandson of slaves was installing engines alongside the daughter of industrialists. High school dropouts were earning more than college professors. America wasn't just outproducing Germany. It was transforming its entire society around the principle of overwhelming material superiority. Colonel Adolf Galland, Germany's general of fighters, witnessed the reality firsthand during Big Week in February 1944. For 6 days, the American 8th Air Force sent 1,000-plane raids against German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, fighting with desperate courage. German pilots flew 3, 4, even 5 sorties per day. They shot down 226 American bombers, each one representing 10 American lives. It should have been a German victory, but the Americans kept coming. The next week brought larger raids. "We were fighting a hydra," Galland would later write. "Every head we severed was replaced by 3 more. My pilots would land, exhausted, having expended every round of ammunition, and look up to see fresh waves of bombers overhead. Fresh escorts, fresh crews. While we patched our planes with parts cannibalized from wrecks, they were rolling new aircraft off assembly lines. One of my pilots asked me, 'How many planes do the Americans have?' I couldn't tell him the truth. It would have destroyed him. The truth was that by mid-1944, America was producing more than 10,000 aircraft per month. June 1944 alone saw 11,247 aircraft completed. This meant that every 3 days, American factories produced more aircraft than Germany had possessed at the start of the Battle of Britain. Every week, they manufactured more planes than Japan would build in the worst month of their war. The numbers became so overwhelming that they lost meaning. It wasn't just combat aircraft. America was producing transport planes at rates that defied logistics. The C-47 military version of the DC-3 was rolling off production lines at 1 every 34 minutes at peak production. By D-Day, the Allies had enough transport aircraft to drop 3 entire airborne divisions in a single night, then supply them continuously by air. Germany, meanwhile, struggled to find transport planes to evacuate wounded from the Eastern Front. Major Gunther Rall, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, encountered his moment of revelation on May 12, 1944, over Brunswick. His unit of 8 Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s had climbed to intercept what they expected to be another bomber stream. What they found was beyond comprehension. The bomber formation stretched for over 200 miles, an aluminum cloud that literally obscured the sun. But it was the escort fighters that broke something in Rall's understanding of the war. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts swarmed like insects, hundreds of them, flying elaborate weaving patterns above, below, and alongside the bombers. "We attacked," Rall reported, "and immediately faced 10-to-1 odds. Not 10 bombers to 1 fighter, 10 fighters to our 1. They weren't even trying to conserve ammunition. They would fire long bursts, break off, and be replaced by fresh fighters. They could afford to be wasteful. We couldn't afford to exist." Rall shot down 2 bombers that day, his 73rd and 74th victories. It didn't matter. The formation didn't even alter course. The disparity in pilot training had become equally decisive. By 1944, American pilots were arriving in Europe with over 300 hours of flight training. They had practiced formation flying over the vast spaces of Texas, gunnery over the deserts of Arizona, navigation over the mountains of Colorado. They trained in aircraft identical to what they would fly in combat. burning fuel that would have kept the entire Luftwaffe operational for a week. German pilots, by contrast, were being sent into combat with less than 50 hours of training, sometimes as few as 20. They flew gliders to save fuel, studied aircraft recognition in classrooms because they couldn't afford to fly actual intercept missions for practice. Oberst Johannes Macky Steinhoff, commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, watched his unit disintegrate not from lack of courage, but from lack of preparation. "We were sending children to fight men who had trained for years," he wrote. Not because the Americans were naturally superior, but because they could afford to be thorough. They had fuel to burn, planes to crash in training, time to make mistakes and learn. We had none of these luxuries. The production statistics achieved their final absurdity in early 1945. America was producing aircraft faster than they could be shipped to combat theaters. Thousands of completed fighters and bombers sat in storage depots in New Jersey, waiting for transport ships. The limitation was no longer industrial capacity, but logistics, how to move the aircraft to where they were needed. Some were simply declared surplus and scrapped without ever leaving America. B-24 Liberators that would have been treasured by the Luftwaffe were being melted down for aluminum to build more B-29 superfortresses. The Americans were literally throwing away more combat aircraft than Germany was producing. At the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg, workers were hand-fitting parts salvaged from crashed aircraft to keep production going. At Willow Run, workers were complaining about overtime schedules as they exceeded their targets month after month. The final meeting between Göring and his fighter commanders took place in January 1945, in a bunker beneath Berlin, as Allied bombers roared overhead. General der Jagdflieger Gordon Golob presented the latest figures. America had produced 96,270 combat aircraft in 1944. Germany had managed 39,807, but only by including training aircraft and gliders in the count. The actual number of German fighters was less than half the official figure. "These numbers are defeatist lies!" Göring screamed, pounding the table. "I forbid anyone to repeat them!" But Oberst Hannes Trautloft stood up, his knight's cross glinting in the bunker's harsh light. "Herr Reichsmarschall," he said quietly, "forbidding us to speak the numbers doesn't change them. Every day my pilots face the reality of these statistics. They're not fighting pilots anymore, they're fighting factories. And the factories have won." Göring ordered him arrested for defeatism. 2 hours later, as Trautloft was being led away, air raid sirens sounded again. Another 1,000-bomber raid was approaching Berlin. Perhaps the most telling moment came not in combat but in captivity. In April 1945, Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, one of Germany's most successful bomber killers, was captured after his fighter ran out of fuel, a common occurrence in the war's final months. His American captors, young P-51 pilots from the 357th Fighter Group, were eager to meet a legendary ace. They shared their flight rations with him: chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned peaches. Meyer stared at the abundance, then asked through a translator, "How much of this do you have?" The Americans laughed, thinking he meant food. "Tons," one replied. "No," Meyer clarified. "I mean everything. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, pilots. How much?" The American flight leader, Captain Charles Yeager, thought for a moment. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "But yesterday my crew chief complained because they sent us the wrong shade of olive paint for touch-ups. We have so much that we can complain about colors." Meyer began to cry, not from shame, but from understanding. "We've been fighting a nation that can afford perfectionism in paint, while we fight with empty fuel tanks. We never had a chance." The final insult came after Germany's surrender. American production records seized by Army intelligence units revealed that the United States had actually throttled back aircraft production in late 1944. They had been producing aircraft faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. Storage facilities were overflowing. The Army Air Forces had actually refused delivery of some aircraft because they had nowhere to put them. While German workers were melting down church bells for aluminum, American factories were debating whether to reduce shifts from 7 days to 6 to give workers more rest. The United States hadn't just met Roosevelt's impossible goal of 50,000 planes in 1942. They had produced 47,836, close enough to validate the promise. But by war's end, they had manufactured 324,750 aircraft total, more than Germany, Japan, Britain, Italy, and the Soviet Union combined. Hermann Göring, awaiting trial at Nuremberg, was shown the final production figures by his American interrogators. He stared at the documents for a long time, then asked for them to be explained again. When assured they were accurate, he made one last protest. "But where did you get the workers?" The American officer, Colonel John Ammon, replied simply, "We used everyone. Women, teenagers, men with disabilities, anyone who could work." Göring shook his head. "We used forced labor from entire conquered nations and couldn't match a fraction of this." Ammon's response was telling. "Free people work differently than slaves, Reichsmarschall." On October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Göring took cyanide in his cell. His suicide note contained a single line about the war. The figures were impossible, but they were real. It was the closest he ever came to admitting the truth he had laughed at 4 years earlier, that American industrial democracy had achieved what German authoritarianism could not, the complete transformation of peaceful production into overwhelming military power, accomplished not through conquest and coercion, but through wages and war bonds, not through ideology, but through industrial logic. The Reichsmarschall, who had mocked 50,000 planes as fantasy, died knowing that America had built twice that many and could have built more. They simply hadn't needed to.